The floorboards gave way with a sound like snapping bone. A cloud of dust, thick with the smell of rot and damp earth, billowed up from the darkness below. For 100 years the old Blackwood homestead had kept its secrets buried, but now a burst pipe and a curious plumber had just peeled back the first layer. Down in the crawlspace, amidst the tangled roots and petrified remains of rats, was a small, crudely made wooden box. It wasn't a coffin, not in the traditional sense. It was too small, too square. Inside, nestled in what looked like yellowed lace, was a skeleton. The bones were impossibly tiny, almost bird-like, but the skull was disturbingly malformed, elongated and asymmetrical. And wrapped around the skeletal fingers of one hand was a tarnished silver ring, etched with a spiral that seemed to pull the eye into its endless, looping design. But that wasn't the most horrific discovery. Lying beneath the infant's skeleton was another set of bones, larger but still heartbreakingly small. They belonged to a young girl, her pelvis shattered, her spine twisted into a permanent, agonizing curve. Forensic analysis would later confirm the unthinkable: she had died in childbirth. Her age was estimated to be no more than 12, and the infant she had delivered, the one buried with her in that unholy grave, was not just her child. It was also her sibling, and her cousin. And something far, far worse. This was the final resting place of Lillian Blackwood, and the unsealing of her tomb was not an end, but a beginning, a doorway into a story so steeped in genetic horror that the official records were burned, the town's memory was scoured, and the very ground was salted to prevent the truth from ever taking root again. The town of Havenwood Creek, nestled deep in the Appalachian hollows of West Virginia, was a place that time had forgotten, and for good reason. It was a pocket of the world sealed off by dense forests and impassable mountains, a place where the outside world was a rumor and bloodlines were the only law that mattered. The 1880 census listed its population as 247 souls, but a closer look at the surnames would have raised an alarm for any outsider. Blackwood, Thorne, Barrow, Willow, the same four names, repeated in an endless, suffocating loop. They were the founding families, the original settlers who had carved a life out of the unforgiving wilderness in the late 1700s, and in their isolation, they had turned inward, their community becoming a closed system, a human terrarium where the same genetic material was recycled generation after generation. The Blackwoods were the most reclusive of them all. Their homestead was the furthest from the town's single dirt road, a sprawling, Gothic-looking farmhouse that seemed to sag under the weight of its own secrets. They owned the sawmill, the only source of income for the town, giving them a quiet, menacing authority. They were known for their striking, almost ethereal beauty in youth, pale skin, raven-black hair, and eyes of a startling, piercing blue. But this beauty was a fleeting, cruel trick. By their 20s, the Blackwood men often developed a stoop, their spines curving, while the women grew frail, their minds clouding over with what the townspeople called the Blackwood fog. They spoke little, moved with a strange, listless grace, and never ever left the confines of Havenwood Creek. A traveling doctor who passed through in 1892 made a chilling entry in his private journal, a document unearthed a century later in a dusty university archive. He wrote, "The people of this valley are afflicted by a malady I cannot name. The children bear a striking resemblance not only to their parents but to their cousins, their aunts, their uncles. There is a sameness to their faces, a hollowness in their eyes. I examined a Blackwood boy today, no older than 10, with fingers webbed like a frog's and a faint, silvery sheen to his skin. His mother claimed it was a sign of being creek-blessed. I fear it is a sign of a curse far older and deeper than any folklore." The doctor noted the prevalence of clubfoot, cleft palates, and infant mortality rates that were 5 times the national average. But his most disturbing observation was about the Blackwood family's obsession with their lineage. They kept a massive, leather-bound book, its pages filled with a sprawling, nightmarish family tree. The lines of descent were not branches, but a tangled, looping web. Marriages between first cousins were the norm. Uncles married nieces. Aunts married nephews. The lines looped back on themselves, creating genetic cul-de-sacs from which there was no escape. The spiral, the the same symbol found on the ring in the crawlspace, was meticulously drawn at the start of each new entry, a symbol of their eternal, unbroken bloodline. They were not just preserving their family, they were purifying it, convinced that their isolation was a sacred duty to keep their bloodline untainted by the outside world. They were tragically, horrifyingly wrong. The first whispers of the true horror began not with a scream but with silence, the silence of empty cradles. In the spring of 1895, a blight seemed to fall upon the children of Havenwood Creek. It started with the Thorne family, whose newborn son was found lifeless in his crib, his tiny body unnaturally stiff, his skin cold and blue. The midwife, a grim-faced Blackwood matriarch named Elspeth, declared it a wasting sickness, a common enough tragedy in such an isolated place. But then, a month later, the Barrows' infant daughter vanished from her bassinet. A frantic search found nothing but a single, small, muddy footprint near the window, too small for any adult. Panic began to curdle the air of the valley. The town's preacher, a nervous man named Reverend Michael, spoke of a darkness taking root, a punishment for unspoken sins. But the Blackwoods remained aloof, their faces impassive, their doors firmly shut. They performed their own rituals, separate from the town's modest church. Strange, melodic chanting could be heard echoing from their property late at night, a sound that seemed to unsettle the very birds in the trees. Young Lillian Blackwood, then only 10 years old, was seen more and more frequently at the edge of the woods, her pale face framed by a cascade of black hair. She was a ghost of a child, silent and watchful. She would stand for hours, staring into the dense thicket, sometimes humming the same eerie melodies that drifted from the farmhouse after dark. She was often seen carrying a small, hand-carved wooden doll, but its features were wrong. It had too many fingers on its hands and a face that was unsettlingly blank. Other children in the village began having nightmares. They spoke of a pale lady who walked through the woods, her feet never touching the ground, whispering their names. They described her as beautiful but terrifying, with eyes that glowed like cold blue stones. Several children woke up with small, spiral-shaped bruises on their wrists. When confronted, the Blackwood patriarch, a towering, silent man named Silas, simply stared down the concerned parents with his unnerving blue eyes and said, "The creek provides and the creek takes. It is the old way." The disappearances continued. 2 more infants vanished without a trace. The town was gripped by a quiet, suffocating terror. They began to suspect a wild animal, a panther or a bear, but the tracks found were always too strange, too humanoid. The true horror was far more intimate. It was during a rare summer town gathering that the first concrete sign of the Blackwoods' grotesque secret came to light. Lillian, now 11, was sitting alone by the creek, trailing her hand in the water. Another girl, bolder than the rest, approached her and tried to take her strange doll. In the ensuing struggle, the sleeve of Lillian's dress was torn, revealing her arm. There, etched into her pale skin, were a series of overlapping spiral tattoos, identical to the one on the ring and the one in the family Bible. But these were not made of ink. They were scars, pale and silvery, as if drawn with a blade made of moonlight. The other girl screamed, and the townspeople saw. For the first time, the fear of the Blackwoods began to outweigh the respect for their power. They were not just reclusive. They were engaged in something unnatural, something that was stealing the very life from the valley. The year Lillian turned 12 was the year the Blackwood fog began to descend upon her. Her already quiet demeanor became almost catatonic. She would spend entire days in her room, the windows shuttered, refusing food. The townsfolk who caught glimpses of her said her belly had begun to swell. The whispers were immediate and cruel. They assumed one of the Blackwood men had forced himself upon the girl, a tragic but not entirely surprising development in a family with such tangled roots. The truth was infinitely more monstrous. A traveling merchant, the only regular link to the outside world, left a sworn statement with a county sheriff decades later, his voice still trembling with the memory. He had made a delivery to the Blackwood homestead in the fall of 1897. No one answered his knock. The front door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he was met with a scene of ritualistic horror. The entire Blackwood clan was gathered in the main parlor. They were chanting in a low, guttural language he didn't recognize. In the center of the room, lying on a stone slab that was usually their dining table, was Lillian. She was in the throes of labor, her small body convulsing. Her eyes were wide with a terror that seemed ancient and profound. Standing over her was not a midwife, but Silas, the patriarch, her father. He held a ceremonial knife. Its blade curved like a crescent moon, and he was tracing spirals in the air above Lillian's swollen stomach. The other family members, her brothers, her uncles, her male cousins, stood in a circle around them, their faces ecstatic, their blue eyes glowing with a feverish light. The merchant fled, never looking back, the girl's agonized screams chasing him down the mountain. The sheriff dismissed his account as the ravings of a drunkard. No official report was ever filed. But within the town, the story spread like a virus. They now understood. The missing infants, the strange rituals, it was all connected. The Blackwoods were not just sacrificing to some dark entity, they were trying to create one. They were breeding, selectively and horrifically, for a specific outcome. They were trying to birth a god or a demon from their own flesh and blood. A look back at the Blackwood family Bible by a skeptical historian in the 1950s revealed the chilling methodology. For generations, they had been meticulously documenting traits, webbed fingers, unusual eye color, and affinity for water, and immunity to local diseases. They were selectively breeding these traits, folding the bloodline back on itself to concentrate them, to purify them. The spiral was their symbol for this genetic whirlpool. Lillian was not a victim of simple incest. She was the culmination of a century-long eugenics experiment. Her father, Silas, was also her great uncle. Her grandfather was also her first cousin. Her family tree was not a tree at all. It was a closed loop, a perfect, horrifying spiral. She had been chosen, prepared since birth, her body marked with their sacred symbol. She was to be the vessel, the mother of their perfect, pure-blooded creation. If you're still watching, you are braver than most. Because what was born in that room was not a god. It was an abomination. The climax of the Blackwood family's grotesque legacy did not happen in a single, explosive moment, but in a series of escalating horrors that unfolded in the suffocating confines of that isolated farmhouse. The labor was unnaturally long, lasting for 3 days and 3 nights. The entire time, the family did not cease their chanting. The sound warped and twisted, becoming less human with each passing hour, echoing through the valley and causing the livestock in nearby farms to panic and break through their fences. Inside the house, the air grew thick and heavy, smelling of blood, sweat, and something else, something metallic and aquatic, like a riverbed dredged up from its deepest, darkest point. Lillian, delirious with pain and fever, was no longer a child. She was a sacrifice, her body a crucible for her family's insane ambition. According to the fragmented, almost incoherent diary of one of her female cousins, a girl named Sarah who later took her own life, Lillian began to speak in the same guttural language as the chanters, her voice unnaturally deep. Her skin, stretched taut over her stomach, seemed to shimmer, taking on the same silvery sheen the doctor had noted on her younger brother years before. The family believed these were signs that the ritual was working, that the creek-blessed child was nearing. On the third night, a storm of biblical proportions descended upon Havenwood Creek. Rain fell in solid sheets, and lightning split the sky, illuminating the twisted faces of the Blackwood clan, their eyes wide with manic anticipation. It was in this tempest of nature and unnatural ritual that the child was finally born. But it was not a child, not a human child. Sarah's diary becomes almost unreadable at this point, the ink smudged by what were likely tears or frantic, trembling hands. She describes something small and pale with a head that was too large and misshapen. It had the signature Blackwood blue eyes, but they were lidless and unblinking. It did not cry. It made a low, clicking sound like stones being rubbed together underwater. Its limbs were too long, its fingers and toes fused together in a grotesque webbing, and down its spine, a ridge of small, fin-like protrusions. The family erupted not in horror but in joyous, ecstatic celebration. They had succeeded. They had birthed their old one of the creek, a being they believed was the physical manifestation of their bloodline's power and purity. They swaddled the creature in lace and placed the silver spiral ring on its webbed hand. But their triumph was short-lived. The birth had destroyed Liliane. Her small frame was broken, her life bleeding out onto the stone slab. As her breathing grew shallow, her eyes, for a brief moment, cleared of the fog. She saw the creature they held aloft. She saw the triumphant faces of her father, her brothers, her kin. And in that final moment of clarity, she understood what had been done to her. She let out a single, heart-wrenching scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror and betrayal that cut through the chanting and the storm. And then she was silent. The creature, as if sensing the death of its mother vessel, turned its unblinking eyes towards the family. The joyous celebration died in their throats. The room fell silent, save for the storm and the creature's incessant, rhythmic clicking. The abomination they had so desperately sought to create was now looking at them not as its creators but as its first meal. The aftermath was a bloodbath. Sarah's diary ends with a single, terrifying sentence. "It is hungry. The creek has come to claim us." The cover-up was swift and brutal, orchestrated not by the law but by the valley itself. The morning after the storm, a profound, unnatural silence had fallen over the Blackwood homestead. No smoke rose from the chimney. No sounds of the sawmill echoed through the trees. A group of men from the town, armed with rifles and a grim resolve, finally breached the property. What they found was a scene from a slaughterhouse. The parlor was drenched in blood. Bodies, or what was left of them, were strewn across the room. Silas, the patriarch, was found near the fireplace, his throat torn out. Others were dismembered, their bodies bearing the marks of teeth and claws that belonged to no known animal. Of the creature there was no sign, and of Liliane there was only the blood-soaked stone slab where she had died. The men, hardened by a life of hardship, were shaken to their core. They knew this could not be the work of a man or a beast. This was the result of the Blackwood's dark dabbling, a curse they had brought upon themselves and, potentially, upon the entire valley. A pact of silence was sworn then and there. They were not motivated by a desire to protect the Blackwood's reputation, but by a primal, superstitious fear. They believed that to speak of what happened, to allow the outside world to know, would be to invite the same fate upon themselves. They feared the creature was still out there, lurking in the creek or the dense woods. The bodies were not given a Christian burial. They were wrapped in canvas, weighted with stones, and sunk in the deepest part of the creek, the very creek the Blackwoods had worshipped. The house was meticulously scrubbed of blood, but the stains had soaked so deep into the floorboards that they could never be truly removed. They then found the small, secret crawlspace beneath the floor. In a moment of what could be described as pity, or perhaps a desperate attempt to appease whatever spirits they had disturbed, they placed Liliane's broken body inside, along with the swaddling clothes they believed were meant for her child. They did not know the creature had survived, nor did they find its remains. They simply sealed the floorboards, hoping to entomb the memory forever. The official story, recorded by the county clerk who was a cousin to the Thorne family, was that the entire Blackwood clan had been taken by a sudden, virulent strain of cholera. A quarantine was declared, and no one was allowed in or out of Havenwood Creek for 6 months. By the time it was lifted, the story had become fact. The Blackwood homestead was declared derelict and left to rot. The family Bible, with its damning, spiral-filled genealogy, vanished. Census records were lost in a courthouse fire a decade later. The town of Havenwood Creek actively erased the Blackwoods from history, a collective act of willed amnesia fueled by terror. The few who dared to question the official story or who spoke of the screams heard during the storm were ostracized, their families threatened with being cut off from the community, a death sentence in such an isolated place. The secret was kept. But burying a body does not kill a ghost, and erasing a name does not end a curse. The legacy of the Blackwood family did not die with them. It seeped into the soil of Havenwood Creek, poisoning the water and the folklore for generations to come. The story of the cholera outbreak was the official history, but the ghost story, the one told in hushed whispers by children around campfires, was closer to the truth. They spoke of the creek child, a pale, glistening creature with webbed hands and glowing blue eyes that would snatch children who strayed too close to the water after dark. They warned each other never to draw spirals in the dirt, lest it summon the creature. Parents used the tale to frighten their children into obedience, never realizing they were preserving the memory of a real-world horror. Strange occurrences continued to plague the valley for the next century. Every few years, a child would go missing near the creek, their disappearance blamed on the treacherous currents or wild animals, but the bodies were never found. Livestock would be found mutilated, not in the way a wolf or coyote would kill, but torn apart with a savage, almost intelligent precision. Fishermen reported seeing something in the water, something large and pale that moved with unnatural speed. They described it as a man made of fish skin, with long, spindly limbs. These sightings were always dismissed as local superstition, the product of moonshine and isolation. In the 1970s, during a federal project to survey and map the more remote areas of Appalachia, a team of geologists stumbled upon the ruins of the Blackwood homestead. Their field notes mention an oppressive atmosphere around the site and a series of strange, spiral-shaped rock formations in the nearby creek bed that appeared to be man-made. One of the geologists, a man named Dr. Alastair Finch, became obsessed with the local legends. He spent years cross-referencing the few surviving records with the local folklore. He was the one who unearthed the traveling doctor's journal and the merchant's sworn statement. He began to piece together the horrifying truth. He theorized that the creature born that night had not only survived but had thrived, an apex predator perfectly adapted to the isolated valley. He believed it was intelligent and that it was still breeding. He pointed to the persistent, statistically improbable rate of genetic disorders that still plagued the descendants of the original Havenwood Creek families. The Blackwood fog had never truly lifted. It had simply been given new names: dementia, schizophrenia, hereditary illnesses with no clear cause. Dr. Finch's research was ridiculed by his peers. His grant was revoked, and he was dismissed as a crank. His final, unpublished paper contained a chilling hypothesis. The creature, a product of perfect inbreeding, was now continuing the cycle. It was abducting locals, dragging them back to its lair in the deep-water caves beneath the valley, and forcing them to procreate, creating a new, even more horrifying generation. It was no longer just the Blackwood bloodline. It was the valley's bloodline. The curse had spread. The story of Lillian Blackwood and the thing she birthed should have ended there, a forgotten footnote in the history of a forgotten town. But it hasn't. The discovery of her bones and the malformed infant buried with her reopened the file. But it's a file that no one wants to read. The local authorities quickly sealed the archaeological findings, citing the sensitive nature of the remains. The official cause of death for the girl and her child was listed as undetermined. The case closed almost as soon as it was opened. The plumber who found the bones suffered a complete mental breakdown and is now institutionalized. His incoherent ramblings about a clicking sound and unblinking blue eyes dismissed as trauma-induced psychosis. But for those who know where to look, the signs are still there. The internet is filled with forums dedicated to strange disappearances in national parks. The Appalachian Trail has more missing person cases than any other hiking trail in America. Every year, dozens of people vanish without a trace in those ancient, mist-shrouded mountains. Most are written off as hiking accidents or animal attacks, but occasionally, a detail emerges that doesn't fit. A strange, spiral symbol carved into a tree near where a hiker was last seen. A blurry photograph of something pale moving in the background of a family's vacation photo. A single, muddy, webbed footprint found on a riverbank. The story of Havenwood Creek is a warning. It's a testament to the darkness that can fester in isolation, the horror that can be born when bloodlines are turned inward, becoming a self-devouring serpent. The Blackwoods thought they were achieving purity. They achieved monstrosity. And the most terrifying question is not what happened back in 1897. The most terrifying question is, what is happening now? How many other isolated communities hold similar secrets? How many other Creek children have been born and have survived and have bred? The creature from Havenwood Creek was the result of 100 years of inbreeding. What does its offspring, another 100 years down the line, look like? Perhaps the Blackwood fog was never a madness. Perhaps it was a change, an adaptation. The beginning of something new and something utterly, horrifyingly inhuman. The next time you see a story about a missing person in the wilderness, look closer. Look for the details that don't add up. Look for the spiral, because the creek still takes, and it is always, always hungry.